one that did not have anything about relationships. I haven't, anyway. So, but a couple weeks ago, Anne and Marilyn talked about Maureen Stewart's whack. And they said that sometimes you need to be honest and direct in communication. But they also said that we have to use discernment when interacting with people. When to be direct and when to be quiet. And after reading this koan, I thought of a few examples in my own life and some things when I read a few things in a couple of books. So, in this koan, I think the old nun is illustrating the latter, where you have to use discernment and sometimes be quiet. She's not commenting on someone else, on someone being a foreigner, nor is she commenting on her past. She doesn't care about the Australian and where she came from. And could it be that she has lost interest in her past? I don't know. She's just staying present with the Australian nun. Let's practice together. Let's get enlightened together. But in both instances, she says together. She doesn't know the Australian nun, but she trusts that all will be revealed in time. It's like she's taking on the mantle of not knowing is most intimate. It's like she's saying, in this tiniest house of time, right now, I trust you to find the path in your own way. She gives no directions or comment. She will just practice beside her. Once, for me, I went on a long retreat at St. Dorothy's Rest. And I sat by another participant the whole time. I never talked to them. I almost never even looked at them. But at the end of the retreat, when I was saying goodbye, I realized that I had learned a lot about them just by sitting next to them in the zendo. Their breathing, their movement, even their demeanor and kindness were quite apparent to me in that silence. It wasn't necessary that I needed to know all the details to know this person. It was as if we communicated without even knowing it. We didn't even have to say a word. Our very existence in this world was a communication. In a little larger situation, a friend of mine was going through a very difficult decision. It was about whether to move to a foreign country with her husband. And it was her husband's dream job. She knew it was something that he was very excited about. And yet, she could not bring herself to agree to go. At first, I said to her, well, it sounds like a really good opportunity. I was thinking about myself, what I might decide. I'd go on hot minute. Then I saw how difficult this decision was for her. So I listened and listened. It became apparent that either decision would be very difficult, going and staying. Both would be difficult to deal with. If she went, she would feel anxiety and that she was abandoning her family. If she stayed put, she would feel like she was betraying her husband. Neither decision would be a happy one. I decided that the only thing that I could offer was my support and love. I realized that any decision is just a decision. A musician friend of mine once said, there are no mistakes, only passing tones. It also reminded me of what Chris has said recently. Life is one continuous mistake, and we try to make the most generous, thoughtful, and kind mistakes that we can. Finally, my friend decided not to go on the move. My friend told me, she said, I just want to forget about what happened because it was so gut-wrenching to arrive at a decision. What I said to her then was, don't forget about this. Keep talking about it together. You will learn from this. And in the end, I was grateful that my friend felt comfortable enough to share her struggle with me, because I was also affected by the situation. It helped me understand my friend better. In her struggle, she was a teacher to me. I didn't have to say a word to be present, just to be impacted by the moment, to share the weight and density of the feeling. Again, there is the saying in Zen, not knowing is most intimate. I have often been perplexed by this saying, but I think I was sort of getting a glimpse of what it means. I was reminded by a passage in The Mind of Clover by Robert Aiken, which is about something of almost global significance. I want to read to you a couple of sentences from that part in his book. It's from this chapter on the Buddhist precept of not killing. And I think he is not talking about killing physically, but trying not to kill a moment of possibility. Okay. I think this. So, let's see. So recently, leaders of a peace organization had arranged to meet with a senior military officer who had broad authority. So think like you're a member of Greenpeace, and you're going to go talk to somebody from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What do you say? The delegation had to figure out what they were going to say. After role-playing several scenarios, the members gave up. And they decided to just open the conversation with the question, how's it going? In other words, this is what Robert Aiken says, in other words, with your truly awesome power, with nuclear war, a possible outcome of something you might decide to do in an emergency, how are you bearing up? And so Aiken says, when we speak from the same side of the counter in this way, then we are human beings together. The we-they dichotomy fades away, and peace becomes a chance. Peace has a chance. So to bring it back to this 200-year-old man, 202-year-old man, who I think's been around the block a few times. I think she would say that the best we can do is to bring listening and invitation to our conversation with others, to remain open and spacious in the presence of another person, regardless of their situation. And I wanted to end with something that Rebecca Solnit said, because I think it relates really well. It's from one of her blogs. Here it is. We walk in fog. We walk on a twisting path through an intricate landscape and cannot see what is ahead. We walk through forests in which we cannot see the past. We can't see past the first few stands of trees, but we know that life is going on there. We don't fully know who we ourselves are, who others are, what's going to happen, what else is happening, how something will play out. And if you're really stuffed full of assumptions, there's no room for discovery. Not knowing is the openness and spaciousness that can reside in mystery or invite an understanding. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think my favorite thing about this process, both in hearing other people and doing it together, is that opportunity to take something and see these different perspectives and then see how it bounces off us. It's just a really fun process. So, and Constance and I did pre-talk about this, just FYI, we're not coming in cold. But when I first read this koan, it really made me think about my journey to being here in this Sangha. I was definitely in a seeking mode, and I had been practicing mindfulness, whatever you might want to call it, at home on a regular basis. And I was in therapy, and my therapist got me a book called Living and Dying with Confidence by a Tibetan Rinpoche. And it was a year-long activity book. So you read the reading, and then there were prompts, and often there was a journal response. Sometimes there was something you actually had to do. And so I did it for a year. And it was a really wonderful experience. And in this book, he kept talking about spiritual friends. Yeah. And I'm like, and there'd be entries. I looked back on my journal from it recently where I was like, these spiritual friends keep coming up. I don't have any spiritual friends. Where do you get spiritual friends? Like, what's this all about? And I came to realize over the course of that year that something was missing, that this just practicing on my own and reading, which was very much in my comfort zone, you know, doing some research, being in control, doing it all by yourself, like that felt just fine to me. That's how we do things when we want to do them right. And I was on a walk with Kyle, who is here today, and she told me about Dharma Heart Zen. And she's like, I think you would really like Chris. You should come check it out. And I had done an Intro to Shambhala series in Santa Rosa and really liked the practice, but hadn't really felt like they were my people. You know, I was like, I can't really see coming and being with these people day in, day out. I don't think that's my jam. So I showed up at Ner Shalom. And, you know, many of you were here, Gretchen and Debbie and Marianne, and I think Shelley, you still came back in this, and Ellen and Constance and Marilyn and Wayne and, you know, this whole crew of people. And I was nervous, and I walked in, and I didn't really know, and I, you know, sat down, and we did our thing, and wasn't a whole lot of small talk. And at the end, I was like, okay, you know, I drove home, and my wife's like, how was it? And I'm like, I'm going back. And I just started coming every Thursday. And I signed up for the practice period, and Constance serendipitously was my partner. And I've been partnered since then with several of you. But it just brought alive for me the new dimension of practice and community and having spiritual friends. And it makes me kind of misty. I mean, I think about that longing of like, what are spiritual friends? What is this going to be? And I'm like, oh, I've got it. And I still kind of feel like the new kid, which is funny. I was thinking about that when I was getting ready this morning. Like, I still sort of feel like, you know, well, I don't really know what's going on. You know, I just show up, and then all these other guys, they all know what's going on, and I just sort of follow along. And I'm like, well, Kristen, you've been doing this now. I think it'll be maybe my 5-year anniversary in August. You know, and I'm like, I'm taking Jukai, and I actually feel like that's an appropriate thing for me to do. I don't totally feel like an imposter. And so it's just really, that was the thing that resonated with me initially, was this notion of the power of practice together. And that power of relationship that's built in a very different way from any way I've ever experienced it. And I've had that experience. I was thinking about St. Dorothy's Rest the first time I went to the Rahatsu retreat. And I sat next to Meg Alexander, who I didn't know from anybody. And she had her robes, and I was like, oh shit, I'm sitting next to a big kid, And just that presence of the person next to you. And I remember at the end of the retreat when we could talk again, we were done dancing around and playing and kind of cleaning up. And she's like, oh, I gotta go get my phone. I'm like, what is she gonna do with her phone? And she runs in and she's like, I wanna take a picture of the wall. And she took a, and I thought, oh, okay. Another human, like we're all human, we're all doing this. There isn't something like just because this woman, is in the priestly garb and, obviously a long-term practitioner, doesn't mean that I can't sit next to her and feel and learn. So that was the first thing that really just hit me about this and just feels so good about Sangha and the importance of it. And then when Constance started talking about not knowing is most intimate, that really struck me as well. And that's just something I'm personally working on, is being able to be with people and listen and not prescribe. And of course, the person it's hardest to do with is my wife. And so just having, just trying to check in with myself and being like, why is it uncomfortable for me to be present with someone else's stress or feelings? And, it's probably because I'm still working on that with myself. And so I really like that notion of how do we find those moments of possibility and let them come forth by just being there and just being present with it. And I know we want to have plenty of time, but I'm just going to quickly share a little bit from Alexandra Porter's reflection. That's not someone I'm familiar with in the Hidden Lamp, but she had some things that we...
That's Meg that you were sitting by.
Meg Alexander.
She's Alexandra Porter?
Meg Alexander Porter,
Oh,
yes.
dear God. Wow. Hello, Synergy. That's so cool. That's amazing. Well,
There you are. Full circle.
I don't even know that, well,
Magic word.
still want to talk about her. So a few of the things that kind of jumped out was she talks about when she first went to Korea and studied, and that she was inspired by people just being helpful and human and just providing what she needed without her even knowing. And so she identifies 3 important points to this koan. The first is 2 people connecting, just sharing their life experience and practice. And she has a quote from the Buddha. If beings knew, as I know, the results of giving and sharing, they would not eat without having given. Even if it were their last bite, their last mouthful, they would not eat without having shared. And that notion of sharing whatever we can feels really important. And there's a little story about a well where people stop using the well, and when the well is stopped being used, it dries out and is forgotten. And that metaphor, if we cease sharing with one another, something in us dries up. So sharing gives and brings life. And personally, sometimes when I'm feeling kind of constricted and stressed, my impulse is to isolate. It's not to be with others. And I've kind of learned that I get more relief actually from sharing, but it's still something that isn't a pathway I've fully developed. And so I need to just keep remembering that. And then the second point she identifies is using our skills when communicating with others, which I think Constance shared really beautifully. And then the third point is relationships. How do we manifest in this world? Are we self-centered or not? Are we trying to force our point of view on others, or are we being present with their needs? Again, as you shared. And so one of the questions that we want to leave you with in your groups is, What did the old nun attain that enabled her to just sit quietly with an unmoving mind, simply repeating her mantra? And as we think about that, we can also think about, what do we want from our practice and our lives? And she says, if we forget the big questions, like, what is this? Who am I? We can get absorbed in the little worries of our day. And she says, this koan's job is to bring us back to the moment. Can we let go of our conditioned way of looking at ourselves and others and respond to situations in a fresh way? So the questions that we're putting forth, and of course you can grab anything you like, is, Constance, do you want to read that one again? So what did the old nun attain?